Welcome weary football pilgrims to lower leagues. In this episode, we move away from the glamour and bright lights of the top echelons of football to the kind of players who appear on old panini stickers with questionable facial hair and haunted eyes, whose boots were held together by willpower and industrial tape, whose careers lived in the margins, in wind-battered grounds named after furniture stores, where the tannoy crackled like an old man trying to remember his wedding vows. You know the type, the left-back with 600 appearances and no cartilage, the keeper who wore the same gloves for a decade and named them after his kids, the midfielder who could pass like Pirlo but only when the floodlights flickered. When you try to define a legend, the usual stats don't really help. A man can win a dozen titles and still be as memorable as a conference call. So we'll use different measures. We'll be looking at 4 things. First, achievement. Not just the shiny bits, but the quiet triumphs, the improbable goals, the seasons spent dragging a club up a muddy hill. Then there's personality, that spark, that glint, that sense that something strange and beautiful might happen when they're nearby, the fury, the joy, the sheer oddness of them. Next, loyalty, that stubborn allegiance to a badge, a place, a people, when staying becomes braver than leaving. And finally, cultural impact. Did they shift the air a bit? Did they make you feel something more than just applause? Were they, for a moment, more symbol than man? So settle in, get comfortable. The kettle's just gone off. It's too late for a proper brew, mind. Just one of those herbal numbers that smells faintly of damp plywood and broken promises. Don't worry, it won't keep you up. Nothing here will. The telly's been off a while now. Just the low hum of the fridge for company, a ghost in the machine. Familiar, lonely, like the last fan in the away end, rattling his car keys in the drizzle after a 2-0 defeat. Nothing left to say, nothing left to feel. Just that quiet, grim acceptance that some things just weren't meant to be. And that's all right, because that's what we're here for, isn't it? To sit a while in the quiet, to get away from the bright lights and the shouting, from the breathless din of pundits debating the angle of a striker's eyebrow, or whether a fourth-choice goalkeeper in Qatar is truly elite. We're not interested in that lot. We're here for the others, the ones who walked a different path, the journeymen and the romantics, the square pegs in round dugouts, the players who belong to a bygone era, or maybe one that hasn't happened yet. These are our legends. You won't see them on a Champions League promo, but they built something quieter and maybe stronger, something that lingers long after the last match day. You remember them not for the trophies, but for the stories, for the time he played on with a dislocated shoulder, for the goal he scored with his knee, his shin, and possibly divine intervention, for the match-winning header where he never left the ground. And the places, oh the places, Moss Rose, Underhill, Victoria Ground, each with their own ghosts, each with their own chip van that may or may not have been condemned by the council. These were clubs sponsored by scaffolding firms, funeral parlours, and once, memorably, a local psychic. Places where the seats were mismatched, the pigeons were permanent residents, and the half-time pie was an act of culinary Russian roulette. But still they came, the players, the fans, the managers who looked like ex-wrestlers and spoke like disappointed uncles. They came and they gave everything. You might catch one now. A retired warhorse sat in the main stand on a rainy Tuesday, coat zipped to the chin, still watching, still hoping, still there. So let's count them down from 10 to 1. Let's see what remains in the quiet dark. Let's remember what football used to be, and what, in some forgotten corners, it still quietly is. Number 10, Cristiano Lucarelli, the legend of the port. The thing about heroes, Real heroes, not the billboard variety with luminous teeth and media training, is they're almost always born from a crack, a rupture, a flaw in the system that lets something genuine sneak through. And for Cristiano Lucarelli, that crack was called Livorno. Now, Livorno's a Tuscan town, technically, but don't picture vineyards or olive groves. Livorno's a port, salt in the air, diesel in the lungs, cranes like mechanical vultures hunched over the docks, where the sea air smells of rust and the promise of a long, hard day's work. It's a town of communists, dockers, anarchists. The football club, AS Livorno Calcio, wasn't just a team, it was a political statement. It was a badge of honor, a scuffed-up flag planted in the mud of modern football, and for a long time it was a pretty rubbish team. Lucarelli, he grew up there, a true Livornese lad, thick-set, brooding, carried a rebel streak like a flare in his pocket. He was a good footballer, no doubt, a proper centre-forward, the kind of striker who'd just as soon stick his elbow in your face as score a goal. He flirted with the big leagues, Atalanta, Valencia, even Torino, an old-school club in a working-class city, but it never quite clicked. He'd arrive at a new club, score a handful of goals, and then the restlessness would set in. It wasn't a lack of talent, you see. It was a lack of soul. He was a man who'd won the lottery, but felt a nagging sense that he'd forgotten to buy the ticket. A journeyman in search of a home, a ship looking for its port. He was playing out of a suitcase in some sterile hotel room in the north, looking out at the city lights and feeling nothing, just a cold, hollow space where his heart ought to be. It was always somebody else's home, never his. And then in 2003 he did the unthinkable. He came home. He was a professional, a Serie A player, and he gave it all up to come back and play for Livorno in Serie B. The Italian press called him mad. His agent probably had to be sedated, muttering about percentages and long-term earnings into a paper bag. But he did it, and not for the money or the glory or any of that guff. He did it for 2 words, the Livorno shirt. He had a tattoo on his forearm of the club's badge, a proper anchor, the kind you'd see on the side of a great rusted freighter. And it was there in the port that his life finally made sense. It was one of those things you don't really believe until you see it, a beautiful, ridiculous surprise. And it worked. Oh, how it worked. He scored and kept on scoring. He dragged them up by the collar into Serie A with the weight of the city, of a whole political movement on his shoulders. He carried them like a man hauling a sunken boat through storm water. He was their leader, their walking, breathing symbol. When he scored, he'd celebrate not with a pose or a punch, but with a hug, an honest-to-goodness hug, like 2 long-lost lovers embracing in the rain. He had this way about him, an old-school romanticism that felt alien in the modern game. When they asked him why he took a massive pay cut, he said, "Some people make love for money, some people make love for passion. I do it for the second one." It's a line that would sound hammy from anyone else, but from him you believed it. It felt like the truest thing anyone had ever said in the history of football. His passion was Livorno, the fans, the cause. In an era where footballers were becoming detached, remote, almost like astronauts in their pristine, air-conditioned worlds, Lucarelli was down there in the trenches with everyone else. He was a proper socialist. He refused to wear boots made by capitalist brands, instead opting for plain black boots with the hammer and sickle on them. It was his quiet, public defiance. A tiny protest in a world of corporate sponsorships and brand deals. The papers would write about it, sometimes with a sneer, sometimes with a kind of grudging respect. He was a fan inside a footballer's body, with a fan's pettiness, fury, and bottomless devotion. He felt every defeat, every missed pass, every unjust refereeing decision as if it were a personal attack. And when he'd score, the joy wasn't his alone, it was shared. It was a moment of collective redemption. The season he was top scorer in Serie A, he won the Golden Boot. He could have gone anywhere. He could have gone to a Champions League club. The money would have been unbelievable. The headlines would have been screaming about him across Europe. But he stayed. He looked at the fans, looked at the town, and he said, "This is my home." Like it was obvious, like he couldn't imagine living anywhere else. He proved that a man could build a monument not out of stone or bronze, but out of pride and grit, and an honest-to-God love for a little club from a scruffy port town. He played like a cargo ship on fire, slow, burning, impossible to stop. But a beautiful story almost never has a perfect ending. There's always a bit of dust, a bit of rust, a little melancholy that clings to the edges. The years went on. The goals started to dry up. The body grew heavier. The knees remembered every muddy tackle, every turn in the rain. It's a hard thing, watching your heroes grow old, like seeing a lighthouse switched off and left to crumble, still standing proud, but no longer guiding anyone home. He wasn't that invincible, brick-like figure anymore. The fire still flickered in his eyes, but the movement was gone. And in 2012 he retired, quietly, inevitably. He'd scored 112 goals in 227 games for Livorno, but that's not the number that mattered. What mattered was what he stood for. A man who turned down the world for one scruffy port town, a myth forged in rust, salt and love. A testament to the idea that sometimes staying put is the bravest thing you can do. Because in the end, it's not about how far you go, is it? It's not about how many trophies you lift. It's about where you lay your head down at night. He didn't just play for Livorno. He was Livorno. And that's worth remembering, even in the quiet dark. Number 9, Cristian Fabbiani, El Ogro. You've had the proper, straight-laced hero. The kind of man who turned down a fortune to stay in a town that smelled of rust. A solid, old-fashioned legend forged in a working-class furnace. And that's a good thing, a comforting thing. But football isn't always like that. It's not always a story about straight lines and honest work. Sometimes it's a story about beautiful, chaotic messes, about men who were a testament to the idea that genius and self-sabotage can sleep in the same bed and snore loudly at each other all night long. And that brings us to Cristian Fabbiani. They called him El Ogro, the ogre, and looking at him you could see why. He wasn't some fleet-footed whippet with a chiseled jaw. He was substantial, a thick-set, old-school centre-forward who looked like he'd been carved out of a single angry potato. You'd see him lumbering around the pitch, a great, broad-shouldered figure with a low centre of gravity that defied the laws of physics and common sense in equal measure. He'd arrive at a new club and you'd think, that's not a footballer, that's a nightclub bouncer who's just remembered he left the oven on. And you'd be half right. He moved like a man lugging a wardrobe up a spiral staircase, all awkward angles and gritted teeth. And then, without warning, he'd take a touch so delicate it felt like silk falling through fog. It made you doubt the laws of physics, or at least the scouting report. They said his talent was boundless, a force of nature, untamed and magnificent like a lion that had somehow developed a liking for sausage rolls and daytime television. And it was there too. In his youth at Lanús in Argentina, you could see it. He had the strength of a bull and the feet of a dancer. He'd hold the ball up with his back to goal, looking for all the world like a man who'd been stuck in wet cement, and then with a quick swivel and a flick of his ankle, he'd put a striker clean through on goal, leaving 4 defenders in a state of existential crisis. He was a phenomenon, but a phenomenon with an appetite. And that's where the story gets complicated, the weight. It was the great recurring punchline of his career, the elephant in the dressing room that would eventually sit on the team's most expensive training equipment. He was meant to be a superstar, the heir to the great Argentine number 9s. He had the flair, the pedigree, but he also had a deep fondness for the good life. He'd turn up to pre-season looking less like a lean, finely tuned athlete, and more like a man who'd just finished a 6-month buffet tour of Europe. The Argentine dailies would run headlines like "Want away ace spotted leaving bakery with 2 trays of croissants," which was probably just a poetic way of saying he hadn't trained in a month and was the size of a Ford Focus. It was a tragedy in motion, only the tragedy was perpetually being interrupted by a comedy sketch involving a misplaced toupee and a dodgy meat pie. His career became a strange, rambling tour of footballing outposts. He'd land in Ecuador, then Chile, then Romania. He was a beautiful, bloated ghost haunting some of the world's most obscure stadiums. He'd sign for a club with the fanfare of a returning hero and leave 6 months later in a cloud of controversy and a public falling out with a manager. The stories were endless. The tales of late nights, of missed training sessions, of arguments about his diet. Once he was fined for turning up to a team meeting eating a sandwich the size of a telephone book. Another time, he allegedly left a training camp because the hotel buffet wasn't inspiring. But for all the jokes, for all the chaos, the talent never truly disappeared. He'd still produce the occasional flick, the improbable assist, the goal that defied physics and logic. There's a clip of him, deep into his journeyman phase, chesting down a 40-yard ball, feinting left, rolling it through a defender's legs, and curling it into the bottom corner like he was sculpting it from clay. Moments that reminded you, under the belly, behind the theatrics, there really was magic there. And then in 2009 he got his chance at redemption. His boyhood club, River Plate, signed him. This was it, the return. The moment where the messy, glorious talent would finally be put to use on the biggest stage. The hope in Argentina was palpable. The fans saw him not as a fat man with a temper, but as a prodigal son, a flawed genius come home. It was one of the most talked about transfers of the year. He was supposed to be the man to lead them to glory. The story was written. All he had to do was show up, put his boots on, and not eat the team mascot. And he started well, a goal or two, some moments of brilliance that reminded everyone why they called him the ogre, why they fell in love with him in the first place. But the weight, the temperament, it always came back. It was like he was battling an invisible ghost that smelled faintly of pizza. The managers would give him a personal trainer, a diet plan. He'd follow it for a week, and then you'd see a photo of him in the paper that looked like a man who was having an argument with his own belt buckle. He never became the hero River Plate wanted. The move was a disappointment. The dream, it faded into the familiar murky light of unfulfilled potential. He drifted off again, to Ecuador, to Colombia, to a litany of lower league clubs in Argentina. The talent was still there in flashes. He'd do something wonderful, a flick or a pass that would make you sit up straight, and then he'd get a booking for arguing with the referee about the brand of chewing gum he was chewing. He became a cautionary tale, a legend in the same way a beautiful, ruined, stately home is a legend. You look at it and you think, imagine what it could have been. But here's the thing, we're so obsessed with perfection, aren't we? With the lean bodies, the six-packs, the perfect, pre-approved sound bites. Cristian Fabbiani was none of that. His career was a mess, a beautiful, glorious mess. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes him a hero. He was disobedient. He refused to conform to the cold, sterile reality of modern sport. He was a walking, breathing monument to human fallibility. He was a true lad who just happened to be blessed with the kind of talent that was bigger than his own self-control. His loyalty wasn't to a manager or a diet plan. It was to his own nature. His cultural impact wasn't winning trophies. It was becoming a folk hero for every football fan who's ever looked in the mirror and thought, yeah, I'm a bit of an ogre myself, really. He may not have a trophy cabinet full of medals, but he left behind something better, a collection of stories, a glorious career that reminds you that football in the end is just like the rest of life. It's full of imperfections, and sometimes the imperfections are the best bit. And Fabbiani, he was the best bit, in all the wrong ways and all the right ones too. Number 8, Chic Charnley, the Hammer of God. We've had the loyal patriot in Lowerleagues, and we've had the beautiful shambling mess of a man in Fabbiani. Two different kinds of heroes held up by two different kinds of light. But some players weren't built for the light at all. They were built for the dark corners, the muddy pitches in the pouring rain, The places where the only thing you had to rely on was the man standing next to you, and the only rule was that you finished the game with more teeth than the other team. And that brings us to Chic Charnley. They called him the Hammer of God, and it wasn't some sort of poetic exaggeration, mind. It was a proper literal description. Chic Charnley was a force of nature, a man built like a sack of spanners with a temperament to match. He played with a kind of incandescent rage, a simmering fury that felt like it had been stoked over a lifetime of petty grievances and bad decisions. He was a midfielder, but in the way a cannonball is a piece of art. He was functional, but primarily designed for destruction. You'd see him in the middle of the park, shoulders hunched, and you'd think, that man is either about to win the ball back or start a brawl with the corner flag. And it was usually the second one. He was a walking, breathing contradiction, was Chic. The stats on him, well, they read less like a football career and more like a police blotter. 17 red cards in his career, give or take. A record for a non-goalkeeper, which is the kind of record that makes you question a man's life choices. There was the time he got sent off after just 5 minutes for a 2-footed lunge, or the time he got a straight red for a tackle so brutal the referee didn't even bother blowing the whistle. He just pointed to the touchline with a look of quiet resignation on his face, as if to say, right, you've had your fun, now get on with it. He was a man who seemed to believe that a tackle was not just a means to win the ball, but a moral statement. A way of saying, this pitch belongs to me, and you, sir, are merely renting it for a moment, and I'd like my deposit back. But here's the thing, and this is the part that gets lost in all the stories about the mayhem and the fighting. For all the bluster, for all the fury, Chic Charnley could play a bit. He had the kind of vision that you just can't teach, the kind of pass that came from the soul, not from a coaching manual. He'd spend 80 minutes of a game looking like a man who'd just been told his car had been towed, and then, in one beautiful, quiet moment, he'd find a man in space with a pass that had the weight and delicacy of a handcrafted apology. He was a sculptor with a hammer who'd use it to smash a statue and then, with the same tool, carve out a masterpiece. His career was a pilgrimage across the Scottish leagues. He was a journeyman, a footballer's footballer. He played for everyone. Clydebank, Partick Thistle, St Mirren, Dundee, Airdrieonians, Stirling Albion, Albion Rovers. You name a club in Scotland, chances are Chic played there or was banned from their car park. He even had a spell at Celtic, a childhood dream, fleeting but real. And a few games for Hibernian, where he scored a winner in an Edinburgh derby and earned a lifetime supply of pints from grateful fans. He was a man who was loyal to no club because his loyalty was to a different kind of truth, a truth that said you didn't have to be a pretty boy with a smile for the cameras, a truth that said a good pass and a bad temper could live in the same body. He was the ultimate outsider, a man who seemed more comfortable fighting than winning, more at peace in the middle of a brawl than in the quiet comfort of a dressing room. Off the pitch, the legend grew even bigger. He was once banned for assaulting his own manager. He got into a fight with a teammate during a five-a-side training drill. There's even a story about him turning up late for training because he'd stopped to help push a broken-down car, only for it to be revealed later that it was his own car, and he'd forgotten where he left it. He was part folk hero, part cautionary tale, part half-remembered fever dream. And that's the thing about a cult hero, isn't it? They aren't heroes for what they achieve. They aren't legends for winning a league title or for scoring 100 goals. They are legends because they embody something more, something raw, something human. Chic Charnley was the fury of the terraces in human form. He was the kind of player every fan wanted to be, just for 5 minutes, when the referee made a bad call or the opposition was getting a bit too clever. He was the unfiltered id of the game. He was the man you'd point to in the pub and say, that's what football is really about. It's not about the fancy stuff. It's about passion. It's about not backing down. It's about having a go. It's a strange kind of legacy, a contradictory thing. You look at his record, all those red cards, and you think, that's not a legend, that's a menace. But then you remember a moment, a pass, a flash of quiet genius in the middle of a raging storm, and you see him not as a hammer, but as a beautiful, terrifying enigma, a man who was too big for the game he played in, a man who refused to be put in a box. The system tried to tame him, the referees tried to stop him, but they couldn't. He was a bit like a bear on a bicycle, wild, improbable, somehow upright, and just dangerous enough to make everyone stand back. You never knew if it was ballet or mayhem, but either way you couldn't look away. And you'd have to admit it was a sight to behold. He proved that you don't have to win anything to be remembered. You just have to be yourself, all of yourself, the good, the bad, and the furiously angry. His cultural impact wasn't in inspiring generations of young players to lift trophies. It was in inspiring them to just be a bit more of a character, to wear their hearts on their sleeves and their tempers on their faces. And that's a quiet, melancholy sort of heroism, the kind of heroism that isn't shouted from the rooftops but whispered in a pub after the lights have gone out, and the only thing left is the quiet memory of a man who was always ready for a fight and always ready with a beautiful pass, a man who was the hammer of God, and a bit of a bloody artist, too. Number 7, Carlos Kaiser, the greatest footballer to never play. How do you become a legend without ever really doing anything at all? That's the question at the heart of the story of Carlos Kaiser. He's not a hero, not in the way the others have been. He's an anti-hero, the patron saint of getting away with it. He was a professional footballer for over 2 decades without ever genuinely playing the game. A ghost in the machine, a conjurer, a professional con artist, a legend of pure, unadulterated fraud. They called him Carlos Kaiser, and the only thing he was a master of, the only thing he was truly loyal to, was himself. His story. It's a baffling, beautiful thing. He was from Rio, and he looked the part. A big lad, fit and well-built, with a smile that could sell sand to an Arab. He had a gift for talking, for telling stories, for charming the socks off everyone he met. He had a magnetic charisma. He'd walk into a room and you'd just feel yourself drawn to him like a moth to a lamp. He'd tell a story about a goal he scored or a pass he made, and you'd just believe him. He could paint a picture with words, even if the picture was a complete and utter fiction. But he had a secret, a quiet, little terrifying secret. He was absolutely rubbish at football. He could barely kick a ball, couldn't pass, couldn't shoot. He was, to put it politely, as much a footballer as your average garden shed is a spaceship. But he became a professional for over 2 decades, and he did it all with a wink and a smile. It started with a network of friends, professional players who owed him favors. They'd get him into trials, into clubs, and vouch for him. The first part of the con was getting through the door. The second was staying there. And this is where he became a master of his craft. He had a forged medical document from a doctor in Buenos Aires, an official-looking letter that said he was in a pre-season training camp with some obscure club in Argentina. So when he'd show up for a trial, he'd already have an excuse ready. He was just easing back into it, you see. He'd signed up for a week-long trial with a club, and on the first day, he'd pull a hamstring in a ridiculously dramatic fashion. He'd grab the back of his leg and scream like a man who'd just discovered he'd been made entirely of paper. The performance was an Academy Award-winning bit of acting. The club doctor would come out, run a few tests, and say, well, it's not too serious, but he needs to rest for a few weeks. And just like that, Kaiser was in. He'd spend the next few weeks at the club, a part of the team, training in the gym, doing laps, but never, ever kicking a ball. He'd charm the managers, be the life of the party, tell them he'd be ready to go in a week or 2. And when that week or 2 was up, he'd find another excuse. The hamstring, it was acting up again. Or maybe it was a knee problem. He was a man who had more injuries than he had proper minutes played. He was a bit like a ghost in a haunted chip van, you see. You knew he was there. He was always getting in the way and causing a bit of a fuss, but you were never quite sure what he was actually doing. But the real genius of the man, that came later. In the 1980s, when mobile phones were the size of small bricks and only the very wealthy had them, Kaiser would carry around a hollowed-out shoe held to his ear as if he was on a call. He'd walk around the training ground whispering into his shoe, pretending to have conversations with agents, with scouts from other clubs, all offering him contracts. Yes, of course, I'd love to play in France, but my loyalty to this club, he'd say, loud enough for the club president to hear. They're a big club, but I need to play. I can't just be sitting around on the sidelines. This, of course, would make the club president feel as if they had a true gem on their hands, a talent so great that European clubs were calling him up at all hours of the day. His reputation, his legend, was built entirely on a lie. He didn't need to be a good footballer. He just needed to seem like a great one. He'd invite journalists to his hotel room for interviews. He'd tell them wild, unbelievable stories about his goals, his passion, his love for the game. He'd talk for hours about a life he had never lived. And they, in their innocence, would print it all, because he was so charming, so believable, so utterly, magnificently full of it. His cultural impact wasn't in what he did on the pitch, but in what he exposed off it. He was an indictment of the entire footballing system. He was a man who looked the part, and that was all that mattered. He exposed the vanity of club presidents who wanted a star player to show off, not a hard-working player who would actually make them better. He was a silent, fleshy middle finger to the notion that skill and talent were the only things that mattered in the game. He was a bit like a mime artist who got a job as a brain surgeon. He could perform all the movements perfectly, but when it came to the actual work, there was nothing there. You might think his story is a cautionary tale, the moral being, don't try to cheat your way through life. But here's the funny thing, the quiet punchline. Carlos Kaiser never got caught, not really. He never did a day of hard work in his life, and he got to travel the world, live like a king, and be a legend. His greatest achievement wasn't a goal or a trophy or a beautiful pass. It was simply not being found out. His loyalty wasn't to a club, but to the con itself, to the lie, to the myth. And in a world of honest-to-God heroes, that makes him something else entirely. An anti-hero, a rogue. A legend in the quiet, empty space where all the other legends are found. He was a man who showed us that sometimes being a hero isn't about what you do, but about what you don't do. He was an artist of avoidance, a master of the disappearing act. And in a world of true heroes, that makes him something else entirely. An anti-hero, a rogue, a legend in the quiet, empty space where all the other legends are found. Because if you're looking for a hero, you've come to the wrong place. But if you're looking for a ridiculous, unbelievable story, well, you found him. Number 6, Billy Sharp, Sheffield's favourite son. Some loyalties are born of a conscious choice, a stubborn refusal to leave. Like Lucarelli, a man who looked at the world and said, "No, this is my town." But other loyalties are more like gravity, a pull, an undeniable natural force that brings you back to where you belong, no matter how far you might wander, and that, in a gentle sense, is the story of Billy Sharp. He wasn't an exotic hero. He wasn't a firebrand or a cheat. He was just a lad from Sheffield, born and bred, a boy who grew up in the shadow of Bramall Lane, dreaming of wearing the red and white stripes. You'd have to be a true cynic, a man whose heart had been replaced with a dusty old calendar, not to feel something when you look at his story, because Billy Sharp lived the dream. He was the honest-to-God poster boy for the idea that a local lad really could do good, a kind of living myth, walking around the pitch like a man who'd won the golden ticket to his own fairy tale. His journey, though, was a winding one. He started out at Sheffield United as a boy full of hope and local pride. He got a taste of the first team, a goal here and there. But then, as it always does in football, the business of it all took over. He was a promising young striker, and the club needed money. So they sold him. A wrenching decision for a young lad to be moved on from the place he loved. He went to Doncaster Rovers, and he was brilliant there. He scored goals for fun. He was the proverbial big fish in a smaller pond, and he was thriving. But still, it wasn't home. There was a quiet disconnect, wasn't there? He was a hero, but he was a hero on loan, a borrowed legend, a bit like a famous painting hung on the wrong wall. It was beautiful, but you knew, deep down, it belonged somewhere else. He had a few more moves after that, a big money transfer to Southampton, a loan to Nottingham Forest, a spell at Doncaster again on a permanent deal, and you could see it. He was a true professional, he worked hard, he scored goals, but it was always a bit hollow. He was a magnificent train, chugging along on some unfamiliar tracks, always looking for a station that looked like the one he'd left behind. He was a goal scorer, a predator in the box, a man who had a sixth sense for where the ball would land. And he'd score, and the fans of those clubs would cheer, and he'd raise his hands to them, but it was always a bit manufactured. He had all the pieces, but the spark, the incandescent flame was missing. A man can be an asset to a club, you see, without being a part of it. He can sell shirts and score goals and still feel as lonely as a cloud. And then in 2015, the pull became too strong. He came back to Sheffield United. The club was in a mess at the time, down in League One. A good club, a real club, but a mess all the same. Most players would have seen it as a step down, a last resort. But for Billy Sharp, it was a homecoming. It was a pilgrimage. He signed a 3-year deal, and the manager, a man who understood these things, said, "He's coming home." And the rest of it was a thing of beauty, a slow-burning romance. He didn't come back and wave a magic wand. He came back and he worked, and he scored. He scored 30 goals in a single season to get them promoted to the Championship. He was the top scorer in the league, a local lad leading the charge. And the goals, they weren't always pretty. He wasn't a man who'd score a 30-yard thunderbolt every week. He was a poacher, a scrapper. He'd tap one in, or he'd get on the end of a cross with a flick of the head, or he'd just be there, in the right place at the right time. A man who was a master of the quiet art of not being marked. He could disappear into a crowd, and then a second later he'd be there, on the end of a cross, with a calm, deliberate finish. But they meant more. Every goal felt like a quiet vindication. A man who had returned to his true home and was now building a monument out of pride and a relentless will to win. He led them to the Championship, and then, improbably, he led them to the Premier League. The celebrations were something else. Chaos. A grown man, a professional footballer, weeping with joy because he'd gotten his club, his city, back to where it belonged. It was a moment of unfiltered emotion in a game that had become all about the artifice. It was like seeing a steam engine just pull into the station, on time, after a long, lonely journey. You couldn't help but be a little bit proud of the old thing. His cultural impact wasn't in being a global superstar, it was in being a local one. He became a symbol, a working-class hero. He proved that sometimes the most profound thing you can do is simply to belong. His loyalty wasn't a choice, it was a core part of his being, a bit like a compass that only ever pointed to one place. His personality wasn't flashy or loud, but it was authentic. He was just a lad who loved his club, and that was enough. He lived out the honest-to-God dream, the one every lad on the terraces has, to leave, to succeed, and to come back home and lead the charge. He was the hero of a true folk tale in a world that had forgotten how to tell them. He's gone now, in a playing sense. But the legend is still there. Carved into the concrete and steel of Bramall Lane, whispered in the pubs on a Saturday afternoon. He was a man who went away, saw what the world had to offer, and came back to where his heart was. And in a game that has lost its soul in the pursuit of money and fame, that's a quiet victory, the kind that lasts. Number 5, Arthur Rowley, the goal machine. Sometimes a legend isn't a person at all. Sometimes it's just a number. A proper, incomprehensible, quiet number that sits there in the record books gathering dust, waiting for someone to notice its impossible weight. And that brings us to Arthur Rowley. The number is 434, 434 goals in the Football League. A number so large it doesn't even sound real. A number that, when you say it out loud in the quiet of a late night, sounds less like an achievement and more like a proper, unassailable mathematical wall. A bit like trying to count all the grains of sand on a beach, and you're just a man with a tea strainer. Now Rowley played in a different world, a world of black and white and muddy pitches and heavy leather balls, the kind of world where a footballer's knees were held together with nothing but hope and a bit of a plaster. The grounds themselves felt more alive, didn't they? A genuine roar from a crowd that was stood on terraces, all of them breathing in the same cold, damp air. He was born in the 1920s, and his career spanned the post-war years, from the late 1940s to the 1960s. It was a time before satellite television and social media, a time when a hero's fame didn't extend beyond the town he played in. He was a working-class goal-scorer, a man who built a legend in the quiet darkness, unseen by the cameras that would follow modern heroes everywhere they went. And the man himself, well, he wasn't a physical specimen, not in the way they are today. He was a stocky lad, a little lump, standing at just 5 feet 7 inches. He wasn't a man who would win an aerial duel with a lamppost, but he had a secret weapon, a terrifying secret weapon. They said his left foot could hit a ball with the force of a small meteorite. Goalkeepers would flinch when he wound up for a shot. They said he broke the arms of more than a few keepers with the sheer power of it all. It was a shot that didn't just propel the ball towards the goal, it propelled it towards an immediate state of confusion and terror for anyone who stood in its way. It was a beautiful, violent thing. He wasn't a man who needed much backlift either. It was a coiled spring of a shot, a quick, brutal motion that left a stinging red mark on a man's shins for days. His career was a masterpiece of quiet, relentless professionalism. He started at Leicester City, and he scored goals there for a few seasons, nearly 100 of them. But it was at Shrewsbury Town where the legend was truly forged. He signed for them in 1958 for a club record fee of £10,000, and in his very first season he scored 38 goals. 38 goals. He was a man who didn't so much play football as he did a methodical deconstruction of the opposition's goal line. It was as if he was a little machine, a steam-powered, single-minded little automaton whose only purpose was to get the ball into the back of the net by any means necessary. He wasn't a man who cared for fancy clothes or a big car. He was a man who cared about one thing and one thing only, the next goal. And he just kept doing it, season after season. The years went by, the teams around him changed, the fashions changed, but Arthur Rowley just kept on scoring. He wasn't a flashy player. He didn't do Cruyff turns or fancy tricks. His was a kind of relentless, quiet genius. His moves were simple. A quick turn, a shove, a little bit of space, and then the hammer came down. He was an artist of the penalty box, a man who understood angles and timing with the sort of quiet, understated grace of an architect. His goal tally grew and grew, climbing up past the 200 mark, then the 300, and then the 400. It wasn't something that was celebrated in the tabloids, not with the screaming headlines you see today. It was just a quiet, steady march towards immortality. And when he retired in 1965, he was a legend in Shrewsbury, a quiet hero in his town. The kind of hero who wasn't on the television, but whose name was on the lips of every lad who dreamt of putting the ball in the back of the net. His cultural impact is a funny, strange thing. He's a legend of a time that most people have forgotten, a quiet monument in the middle of a fast, loud, modern world. His record stands to this day, 44 goals, a number that will almost certainly never be broken, because the game has changed. A player who scores 30 goals a season now gets a transfer to a big club for a fortune. They get a year or two in the sun and then they're gone. The idea of a striker staying at one club for years, quietly, relentlessly scoring goal after goal, is as alien to us now as the idea of a man on the moon. So what does his story mean? Maybe it's a lesson in the value of consistency, in the quiet, unassuming power of doing one thing very, very well for a very, very long time. His loyalty wasn't to a club, not in the way of a local lad like Billy Sharp. His loyalty was to his craft, to the idea of scoring goals, and to the simple belief that that was all that mattered. He may be a hero from a quieter time, but his achievement is louder than any other. He is a testament to the idea that true greatness can be a simple, repetitive act done with quiet dedication over a long, long time, an unstoppable machine. Number 4, Ansgar Brinkmann, the white Brazilian. There are heroes who build monuments out of goals, heroes who forge their legends in loyalty. And then there are heroes who are legends for a more simple reason. They were just themselves, an uncompromising, stubborn version of themselves that refused to fit into a system, no matter how much that system tried to bend them. And that brings us to a German lad named Ansgar Brinkmann. They called him the white Brazilian, which for a German footballer of his time was about the highest compliment you could get, and also the most confusing. German football was built on discipline, on order, on organised hard work and clean sheets. It was a well-oiled machine that ran on efficiency and grit. And then there was Ansgar Brinkmann, a midfielder who played with the kind of lazy, beautiful flair that you'd normally only see on a sun-drenched beach in South America. He had the touch of an artist, the vision of a poet, and the work ethic of a teenager who's just discovered a comfortable sofa. And that was his story, wasn't it? A magnificent, terrible contradiction. On the pitch, he was a thing of beauty. He could dribble through 3 defenders as if they were mannequins. He'd pull off a little flick or a pass that had no business being in a scrappy German second division game. It was a surreal thing to watch. He'd be standing there, looking like he was just waiting for a bus, and then, with a little shimmy and a flick of the heel, he'd turn a defender inside out and be gone. It was as if a man who had been trained as a bricklayer had suddenly, out of nowhere, decided to paint a Renaissance masterpiece on the side of a garden shed. It was brilliant. But you always knew deep down that the bricklayer would be back, and he'd probably be a bit late for work too. And off the pitch, that's where the other side of the story came to life. He was a rock star in a footballer's body. A bohemian who believed that life was for living, not for following a rigorous training schedule. He'd spend his nights in clubs and his mornings in bed, and his afternoons he'd spend recovering from his nights and his mornings. The stories were endless. The tabloid headlines were a kind of poetry. He was a man who was more famous for his love of nightlife than his love of the game. He was a hero to every working lad who'd ever looked at his boss and thought, "I'd rather be in bed, thanks very much." He was a master of the dry, weary punchline. When a journalist asked him if he'd ever been a footballer, he said, yes, for a few years, and then the circus came to town. When he was asked about his constant nightlife, he said, "I have to train for the games, and I have to train for life." He was a man who understood the absurdity of it all. He was a walking, talking, philosophical retort to the notion that all of life's problems could be solved with a good run and a bowl of pasta. The managers, old-school men in tracksuits, would look at him with a mix of fury and baffled awe. How do you punish a man who sees a fine as just an administrative inconvenience? A manager at Rot-Weiss Essen once told him he had to pay a fine for being late to training. Brinkmann just pulled out a wad of cash and said, "Take what you need and don't tell me when I'm late again." A bit of genius, that was. His career, predictably, was a pilgrimage across the German leagues. He was a man who was loyal to no club because his loyalty was to a different kind of truth. He played for Eintracht Frankfurt, for Arminia Bielefeld, and a dozen other clubs, always leaving in a flurry of chaos and unfulfilled potential. He'd arrive, he'd dazzle them for a few months, he'd get into some public dispute with a manager over his lack of discipline, and then he'd move on. He was a man who was a bit too much for the people in charge. He was a genius, but a genius who came with an unwritten list of conditions. He was a bit like a beautiful classic car. You could buy it, you could own it, but you knew, deep down, that it was going to break down on you at the most inconvenient moment, and you'd just have to accept it. And here's the quiet, melancholic bit. Was he a failure? By the cold, hard metrics of the game, you could argue he was. He never won a title. He never played for the national team. He never became a global superstar. But here's the thing about success, isn't it? It isn't always measured in trophies and contracts. Sometimes it's measured in stories, in the quiet, lingering sense of awe that a player could be so magnificent and so flawed at the same time. He was a living monument to the idea that you can choose your own path, even if that path is a bit of a mess. He was a walking, breathing question mark over the very idea of what a footballer should be. His cultural impact wasn't in winning titles, it was in becoming a symbol of rebellion. He was a hero to the misfits, to the quiet, creative souls who felt suffocated by the rigid, grey world of modern football. He was a reminder that you didn't have to look like a bodybuilder or talk like a robot to be a hero. You just had to have a soul, a bit of wit, an uncompromising sense of who you were, even if that meant you were always a little bit of a shambles. He was a beautiful, flawed, brilliant creature, like a dusty jukebox in the corner of an old pub, scratched up, out of place, half the buttons stuck. But every now and then, someone finds the right song, and for a few minutes, the whole place goes quiet. That was him. Not perfect, just unforgettable. The stories, the quotes, the quiet, lingering question of what could have been. He was a legend not for what he did, but for who he was, a one-of-a-kind lad who was just a bit too much. Number 3, Andy Hessenthaler, the Hess. You know, we've talked about heroes of flair and heroes of fraud and heroes of furious temper, men who lit up a game with a flash of light and then moved on. But there's another kind of hero, a quieter one, a man who builds a legend not out of magic or chaos, but out of simple, honest-to-God graft. The kind of man who'd look at a mountain and say, right then, let's get on with it. And that brings us to Andy Hessenthaler. They called him the Hess, and if you've ever seen him play, you'd know why. He was an action verb and a testament to the idea that a man could get by on sheer, bloody-minded will alone. His story is a journeyman's tale. He started out as a young lad in non-league, learning his trade in the mud and the cold. It was the kind of football played on pitches that felt less like a sporting venue and more like a well-irrigated battlefield. His time at clubs like Fisher Athletic and Slough Town wasn't about the bright lights or the big money. It was about putting in the hard yards for 10 quid a week, getting your knees covered in mud and coming home on an old coach that smelled of liniment and disappointment. That's where he was forged, in the unglamorous reality of it all. He was a midfielder, but in the way a wrecking ball is a piece of construction equipment, he was a relentless, no-nonsense engine in the middle of the park. And for a while he bounced around, a working man in a working man's game. But then in 1996 he arrived at Gillingham, a club in the old Division 2 with ambition and a plan. And in that little corner of Kent, under a grey sky, he found his home. And from the moment he walked through the door, he was part of the furniture. He wasn't a flashy player, mind. He wasn't a man who would score a 30-yard thunderbolt every week. His genius was in his running, in his tackling, in his ability to be in 3 places at once like an over-caffeinated ghost. He was the kind of player who would chase down a lost cause as if it was his last ever chance to get a brew. He was the physical embodiment of the club's ambition, an unstoppable force that just kept on going no matter what. He was like your uncle's old Land Rover, a bit rough round the edges, smelled faintly of grit and tea, but once he got going, there was no stopping him. When he went in for a tackle, it didn't so much win the ball as rearrange the pitch around it. A man would have the ball feeling all clever, and then all of a sudden there'd be a blur of white and blue, and the ball would be gone, and the lad would be on the floor, wondering what on earth had just happened. He was the voice on the pitch too, always shouting, always organising, always pushing the other lads on. His presence was a comforting thing. You knew that as long as Hess was out there, the fight wasn't over. But here's the thing, the bit of madness that makes his story a legend. In 2000, after a few seasons of consistent success, the club did something unusual. They made him the player-manager, a one-of-a-kind dual role, and it was a testament to the kind of man he was. He'd spend all week on the training ground, barking orders at the lads, telling them where to run, where to pass, and then on Saturday he'd go out there with them in the thick of it, a living example of everything he'd just told them to do. It was a surreal thing to watch. You'd see him on the touchline looking intense, and then 5 minutes later he'd be out there in the middle of a tackle with a snarl on his face. The stories from that time, They're the stuff of legend. The lads would go out on a Friday night and they'd see the gaffer, the man who was supposed to be a professional authority figure, out there with them, having a laugh. He'd have to make the substitutions, and then after the game he'd be in the dressing room with the lads, muddy and bruised, trying to have a professional conversation about tactics. It was a beautiful, ridiculous kind of chaos. A true bit of human theatre in a game that was already starting to get a bit too sterile. The mental and physical toll of it all must have been mad. 1 minute he's a player, getting kicked and bruised, and the next he's the manager, worrying about the next contract, the next result, the next bit of bother. But he never complained. He just got on with it. He was the heart and soul of that team, a man who was both in the trenches and on the watchtower at the same time. He was a living symbol of a club that had clawed its way up from the bottom. And even after he gave up the playing part of the role, he stayed. He was the emotional core of the place. He had a few more stints in charge, and even when they didn't work out, you knew deep down that he was always Gillingham. His loyalty wasn't just a career choice, it was a deep part of his being. A man who found a home and simply refused to leave. He'd get a call from the chairman years later when the club was in a bind, and he'd just say, "Right then, I'll be there," and he'd just go back. Like a homing pigeon that just can't stay away from its roost. So what does his story mean? It means that a legend doesn't have to be a genius or an iconoclast. It can be a man who just works. A man who understands that success isn't a single moment of glory, but a long, slow, grinding battle. A daily commitment. Andy Hessenthaler was a hero for every single person who has ever had to put in the hard yards. For every working man who knows that life isn't always a flash of light, but a quiet grind. His cultural impact was in becoming a symbol of the soul of lower league football. A living testament to the idea that a man who cares more than anyone else can achieve something that seems impossible. He may not be a household name, he may not have a trophy cabinet full of medals, but his name is etched in the memory of a whole generation of Gillingham fans. He was a legend of the unglamorous hard work that makes the beautiful game what it is in the lower leagues, a hero of pure, uncompromising dedication. And that's something worth remembering even in the quiet dark. Number 2, Mágico González, the Salvadoran wizard. We've talked about heroes of hard graft, the men who built their legends out of sweat and loyalty and a sort of beautiful grinding determination. But sometimes a legend isn't built at all. Sometimes it just happens. It floats down from the sky, a fleeting bit of magic that reminds you of what the game can be when it's just pure, unadulterated joy. And that brings us to Jorge Alberto González Barridas, but you can just call him Mágico González, because that's what he was, magic. Now his story is a contradiction, a Salvadoran lad who played with a kind of glorious, lazy genius that felt like it belonged in a dream. He was a winger, but he wasn't a man who would run up and down the touchline like a lawnmower. He was an artist, a man who would receive the ball and just do things. A man who could dribble through 3 or 4 players with the kind of sleepy, effortless grace that made you question if they were even trying to stop him. It was a hypnotic thing to watch. He'd just glide past men with a little flick of the heel or a shimmy of the shoulders, and they'd be left standing there looking at each other as if they'd just had a conversation with a ghost. He was a painter with a paintbrush. A man who saw the pitch not as a straight-laced canvas, but as a chaotic, swirling mess that he could make sense of with a flick of his ankle or an elegant bit of footwork. And the anecdotes, they're the stuff of myth. He'd score a beautiful goal, and then he'd be found after the game having a laugh with the opposition defenders he'd just humiliated. He played for the joy of it, for the love of the ball. It was like he was a big kid who'd never grown up and had somehow been given a contract to do what he loved the most. He was a living, breathing myth who just happened to be playing in the middle of a professional league. His journey took him to Cadiz in Spain, a sleepy little club in a sleepy little town, and it was there in that little corner of the world that his legend truly took hold. He was a star. The fans adored him. They called him Mágico for a good reason. He'd do things on the pitch that no one else could. He'd score a goal from a ridiculous angle. He'd do a little flick, a little pirouette that made you laugh out loud in pure, astonished delight. He was the kind of player that you'd buy a ticket just to watch him warm up. The kind of player who reminded you that the game wasn't just about winning or losing, it was about beauty. It was about a beautiful moment that made your heart feel a little bit lighter. But here's the thing, and here's where the beautiful, heartbreaking bit of the story comes in. The man had no discipline. None at all. He hated training. He hated being told what to do. He'd turn up late or not at all. He'd miss an important match to go to a party. The stories are endless. There's the famous one where he went on trial with Barcelona, the big boys. He was brilliant, a flash of pure, unadulterated genius. The scouts were watching him, looking at each other with wide-eyed expressions of pure disbelief. They'd never seen anything like it. He was a man who could turn a football into a living thing. The club was ready to sign him. And then, on an important day, they went looking for him. He'd snuck out of the hotel and gone to a local disco, and he was nowhere to be found. The manager, a no-nonsense sort of man, just gave up, and Mágico, the man who was on the verge of becoming a global superstar, just went back to Cadiz, a legend of a man who just couldn't be bothered with the paperwork. And that was his life, wasn't it? A series of unfulfilled promises. He had a trial with Paris Saint-Germain, the big French club, and it was the same story. He was brilliant, but he couldn't be bothered with the professional life that came with it. He was a living testament to the idea that you could have all the talent in the world and still not be a professional footballer. He was a man who was so brilliantly lazy that he just couldn't be tamed. His coaches would try everything. They'd fine him, they'd shout at him, they'd make him run laps. But he'd just look at them with those sleepy eyes and give a little shrug as if to say, "What's the point? It's just a game, isn't it?" And that was his quiet genius. He was a man who understood that the game was meant to be fun. He wasn't in it for the money or the fame or the glory. He was in it for the love of a beautiful moment. And maybe, just maybe, he was right. Maybe the system was wrong. We try to put creative geniuses into boxes and we get frustrated when they don't fit. We try to turn an artist into a disciplined soldier. And maybe in the end that's the real failure. The failure of the system to understand the magic. He went to another Spanish club, Real Valladolid. A bit of a different place. Not as laid back as Cadiz, but still. He had a season there. A good season, too. He'd show up to training late, looking like he'd just woken up from a long nap, and then he'd go out and do something that would make your jaw drop. A flick, a pass, a dribble through 3 men. His teammates, they'd get frustrated with him, of course. A professional footballer wants to see his teammate in the gym, on the training ground, putting in the hard yards. But Mágico was a different beast altogether. He was a man who was a law unto himself. He was a bit like a beautiful old grand piano that you just found in a dusty attic. It might be a bit out of tune and have a bit of rust, but when you hit the right key, it can still make a sound that moves you to tears. And that perhaps is the truest victory of all. His legacy isn't a trophy cabinet, but a collection of whispered stories, a glorious, beautiful, heartbreaking shambles of a career that reminds you that football, in the end, is just like the rest of life. It's full of flaws and imperfections. We look back at him and we ask that question, don't we? The big one. What if? What if he'd had a bit of discipline? What if he'd signed for Barcelona? Could he have been the greatest of all time? We don't know. And maybe that's the point. Maybe his greatness was in the what if, in the quiet, lingering possibility of what could have been. He's a hero not for what he did, but for who he was. A one-of-a-kind lad who was just a bit too much for the world to handle. And in that, there's a quiet victory. Number 1, Adebayo Akinfenwa, the beast. And so here we are, at the end, the last one on the list. We've travelled across the world and through time, from the quiet, dignified loyalty of an Italian port to the chaotic genius of a Salvadoran nomad. We've seen heroes who were honest men and heroes who were cheats. We've seen men who were a testament to pure talent and men who were a monument to pure, honest-to-God graft. And now we reach the final one, the culmination of it all. A man who was all of those things at once. A walking, talking monument to the idea that in football the greatest strength a man can have is to be himself, completely and without apology. This is the story of Adebayo Akinfenwa, They called him the Beast. And for once, the name wasn't some sort of poetic metaphor. It was a literal truth. Akinfenwa was a physical impossibility. He was a striker who looked like he'd been carved out of a sturdy block of granite. A man with the kind of shoulders that looked like they belonged on a cargo ship. You'd see him lumbering towards a defender, and you'd think, that's not a footballer. That's a nightclub bouncer who's been told there's free cake in the penalty box. He wasn't quick, mind. He wasn't a man who would run for 90 minutes like a greyhound. He was a slow-moving boulder, and his genius was in being simply immovable. He'd receive it with the calm of a moored cargo ship, vast, deliberate, utterly unbothered by the tugboats yapping at his stern. You didn't dispossess him, you merely orbited for a while. His career was a steady climb up the leagues and then a steady march down them again. From Watford to Swansea, and then from Northampton to Wimbledon to Wycombe Wanderers. He was a journeyman, but his loyalty was a different kind. His loyalty was to himself, to his brand, to his persona, to the idea that he was a man who played the game his own way and on his own terms. In an era where footballers were becoming lean specimens of physical perfection, Akinfenwa was a glorious anachronism. A big lad who succeeded in the most physically demanding sport on earth by simply being a big lad. He was a living rebuttal to everything they taught you in a modern sports academy. The coaches would have a spreadsheet full of metrics, and he'd just look at them and say, right then, let's get on with it, and then go and do something that wasn't on the list, like brute force his way through a back line. He was a man who understood that sometimes the best way to be a hero is to just be a bit of a bloody annoyance to everyone else. And the goals, they weren't always pretty. He wasn't a man who would score an elegant bit of poetry. He was a man who would score a clumsy, beautiful piece of brutalist architecture. A physical shove in the back. A header from a corner that felt less like a piece of skill and more like an unassailable act of will. He was a man who scored 10 goals in a season and then 15 and then 20. A relentless goal-scoring machine that had all the aesthetic grace of an old steam train, but all the unstoppable power of one too. You'd see the opposition defenders arguing amongst themselves, all pointing fingers, all looking for someone else to blame for the mess he'd left behind. He wasn't a flashy man, but his personality. His personality was an undeniable force of nature. He was funny. He was charming. He had a disarming self-awareness about him. When a commentator would mention his weight, he'd just look at the camera and give a little wink. He was in on the joke. He was the author of the joke. But here's the thing, the bit where his legend slips out of the lower leagues and into something much stranger, much bigger. Adebayo Akinfenwa didn't become famous just for what he did on the pitch. He became famous for what he represented off it. He became a global star because of a computer game, FIFA. They gave him a strength rating that defied sense, comically high, cartoonish even. The strongest player in the game, and just like that, he became a phenomenon. Kids who'd never seen Wycombe play, who couldn't point to Buckinghamshire on a map, were using him to bulldoze defenders made in labs. He was an avatar for chaos, a cheat code in human form. And it didn't stop there. He built a brand, a voice, a presence. YouTube channels, clothing lines, documentaries, all powered not by media polish but by sheer charisma and honesty. He became a hero of the digital age, not a filtered, PR-friendly one, but a proper grounded one, a working-class cult icon in a world of avatars. He was like a blockbuster action hero from the VHS era who'd wandered onto a Netflix set, oversized, charismatic, and impossible to ignore. He didn't belong, and yet he stole the show. His story is a quiet culmination of all the legends we've talked about. He had the stubbornness of Lowerleagues, the unshakable sense of self. He had the unconventional physique of Fabbiani and the chaotic personality. He had the hard graft of Hessenthaler, the sheer relentless will to keep going. He had the ability to turn a simple physical thing into a powerful piece of art, just like Arthur Rowley. He was a man who understood that you don't have to be a genius to be a legend. You just have to be a character. He showed us that the best way to win is to simply be yourself, to embrace your flaws, and to find a genuine way to connect with the people around you. He didn't chase fame. He became famous by being a genuine person. And that perhaps is the truest victory of all. In a game that now feels like a polished corporate product, a machine designed for efficiency and profit, Akinfenwa was a living testament to the human spirit. He was a reminder of the quiet, beautiful absurdity of it all, of the simple, unglamorous joy of a header, a tackle, and a win. His legacy isn't just in the goals he scored or the promotions he won. It's in the millions of people who, for a few years, saw a lad who was living a dream that was his and his alone. A dream that looked a bit like an old-fashioned number 9 and a bit like a viral sensation. His cultural impact wasn't in winning a title. It was in becoming a symbol. A genuine hero for the misfits, for the big lads who didn't fit in, for the hard-working men who knew that life wasn't about being a lean, perfect model of a human being. It was about being yourself. His loyalty wasn't to a club, but to his own unflinching identity. His achievement wasn't a trophy, but the sheer, beautiful, ridiculous fact of his existence as a professional footballer. He was a testament to the idea that you can be a hero by just being yourself, flaws and all. And so his story ends our list. A quiet, triumphant end. He may be the last of our heroes, but he's also a testament to the future of the game. He proved that you can be a genuine legend by just being yourself, flaws and all. A folk hero for the digital age, a man who built a legend on nothing but his own magnificent, stubborn self. And that's something worth remembering, even in the quiet, dark. Conclusion. That's the thing about football, isn't it? It's never really been about the shiny stuff. Not deep down, not when you're honest with yourself. The trophies, the fireworks, the big money deals, they're just the gloss on the old match programme. The noise on top of something quieter, something slower, something a bit more human. The real game, the one we carry with us, lives elsewhere, in the clack of studs on a concrete tunnel, in the rattle of the away end when only 30 made the trip, in the sigh of a fullback who knows he's got to do it all again next Saturday. It lives in the ghost of a sliding tackle or the warmth of a memory you didn't know you'd kept. A moment when the sun hit the pitch just right, and for a second, everything made sense. And that's where we've been tonight, wandering, not sprinting, not arguing about expected goals or heat maps or whether a man who's never set foot in Middlesbrough should be allowed to comment on their back four, just drifting like an old scarf on a breeze through the forgotten corners of the game, through chipped turnstiles and foggy nights and tales that don't quite make the headlines, but somehow matter more. We've met the lifers, the lunatics, the nearly men and never weres, men who scored 1,000 goals in the dark and men who never kicked a ball but somehow still got signed, men who lived the dream and men who lived something altogether messier. But all of them, they mattered in their own strange, lovely way. Because that's what this is really about, not the game itself, but what it lets us feel, belonging, nostalgia, a bit of hope, even if you know you'll get beaten 4-0 away at Macclesfield. It's about the rituals, the pie, the pint, the turn to your mate that says, he's rubbish him, even though you say it every week and still mean it with love. And maybe that's why you're here too. Maybe you found a bit of yourself in these stories, a bit of quiet dignity, a bit of ridiculousness, a bit of home. So if you like this, if it made you smile or nod or drift off halfway through, give it a little thumbs up. Click that subscribe button. Helps keep the lights on. Helps the stories keep coming. There's more where this came from, much more. We've barely scratched the surface of the strange, the wonderful, the utterly daft world that lives just below the top flight. And you're always welcome back. Same kettle, same bad tea, same stories. Maybe next time we'll talk about haunted mascots, or forgotten formations, or the one-legged winger from East Grinstead who once got sent off for arguing with a horse. All true, more or less. So sleep well, dream deep, and remember, football's not just a game. It's a way of remembering who we are and who we might have been if only we'd made that trial at Rochdale in '97. Right then. Time for a kip.